9.
Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing a star just fracture into a million burning pieces.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then days later, a third of the world's rivers turn intensely bitter. Wildlife dies off in droves, and global food chains they completely collapse.
It sounds exactly like a modern science fiction doomsday thriller.
It really does. But it was actually written nearly 2,000 years ago. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a biblical prophecy was subjected to a modern astrophysics and chemistry analysis?
It creates a fascinating intersection, really. I mean, you were taking this ancient, highly symbolic text and subjecting it to empirical, hard data.
And that is our exact mission for this deep dive. We're going to map the physical and chemical mechanics of comets onto the ancient description of the Wormwood star falling to Earth.
Right, the Third Trumpet judgment.
Exactly. And to do this, we've pulled together an incredible stack of sources for you. On one side, we have analyses of the Book of Revelation, specifically that Third Trumpet sequence. And on the other side, we have peer-reviewed scientific studies on cometary makeup.
Some really heavy hitters, too.
Oh, yeah. We've got data from the Proceedings of the Royal Society A, Qualomer chemistry research from Faraday discussions, orbital mechanics from the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society.
And that brilliant experimental study out of France, right? Semaphore Cometaire.
Yes. The contrast between these sources is stark, but the alignment between these wildly different fields is genuinely surprising.
We're simply unpacking the fascinating parallels between the ancient writings and modern astrophysics.
Okay, let's unpack this. So where do we actually start the timeline?
Well, to establish the baseline, we need to look at the narrative event itself. In the Book of Revelation, there is this chronological sequence of global disruptions.
The trumpet judgment.
Right. Announced by angels blowing trumpets. So, the sequence we are analyzing today is the Third Trumpet. The text essentially states that the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters.
But the word translated there as star, it requires some context, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah. Because in the original Greek, the word is aster. And for a reader in antiquity, aster didn't mean, a massive hyperdense sphere of plasma millions of light years away, like our sun.
No, not at all. They didn't have that cosmological model.
Right. It was a catch-all term for essentially any luminous celestial body in the night sky other than the sun or the moon. So a planet, a meteor, or crucially, a comet would all be classified under the umbrella of an aster.
What's really fascinating here is the specific visual modifier the text uses. It describes the object as burning like a torch.
Which is a very specific image.
It is. And for a naked eye observer, that perfectly describes a comet's coma.
The glowing envelope around it.
Exactly. When a comet approaches the inner solar system, solar radiation causes its volatile materials to sublimate. It turns from solid ice directly into gas, skipping the liquid phase entirely. So this creates a massive glowing envelope of gas and dust called a coma.
And then the solar wind catches it.
Right. The solar wind pushes it outward to form that iconic directional tail. So to someone 2,000 years ago, it looks exactly like a torch flaming in the wind.
That visual alone is striking. But the text gives us a mechanical detail that is even more crucial. Because if you look at the judgment immediately preceding this one, the Second Trumpet, a massive object hits the ocean intact.
Yeah, the mountain burning with fire.
Right. It's thrown into the sea. But this Third Trumpet object operates completely differently. It doesn't hit the Earth as a single solid mass. The text says it falls upon a third of the rivers and the springs of waters.
It fractures. It scatters over a massive global footprint.
It's the difference between like a single rifle slug and a shotgun blast. The comet breaks apart and peppers the Earth's freshwater systems. But based on our astrophysics sources, why exactly does this celestial body shatter in the atmosphere instead of hitting the ground intact?
Okay, let's unpack this, because if I'm picturing a celestial impact, my mind immediately goes to a massive crater in one spot, like a sniper bullet.
A single point of impact, yeah.
Yeah, but targeting a full third of global freshwater simultaneously. That sounds way more like a cluster bomb detonating in the upper atmosphere.
Yeah.
How does a celestial object do that?
Well, the physics of atmospheric entry heavily supports that cluster bomb visual, and it really highlights the fundamental difference between an asteroid and a comet. So asteroids are dense, right? They're rocky or metallic. They punch through the atmosphere and leave a crater. But comets are incredibly fragile.
Like the old dirty snowball idea.
Well, yeah, but instead of a dirty snowball, it's actually much more accurate to picture a comet as a loosely packed gravel bank. Just a bunch of debris held together by dry ice and frozen gases.
Oh, wow. Okay, so when that fragile gravel bank hits the Earth's atmosphere at like 40,000 miles per hour?
The aerodynamic pressure is unimaginable.
Yeah.
I mean, the front of the comet hits the increasingly dense atmosphere like it's hitting a brick wall, but the back of the comet is still moving at orbital speeds.
So it just crushes itself.
Exactly. The entire structure compresses, and the friction generates thousands of degrees of heat almost instantly. The thermal shock causes all those volatile ices deep inside the comet to flash boil into vapor.
And the gas has nowhere to go.
Right. So the comet violently explodes midair from the inside out. This is what we call an airburst.
So there is no single impact crater. The comet basically vaporizes into a massive, expanding cloud of superheated gases and debris in the stratosphere.
Yes.
And because the Earth is, constantly rotating beneath this atmospheric explosion, high-altitude wind currents would grab that vaporized material and stretch it across a massive swath of the globe.
A truly global dispersal.
Right, so as it settles, it enters the precipitation cycle. It rains down across a massive percentage of the planet's surface area, so it could easily blanket a third of terrestrial rivers and springs.
Which brings a terrifying realism to the ancient description. The dispersal mechanism isn't a targeted strike on specific rivers. It's a global aerosol spray of whatever chemical payload that comet happens to be carrying.
Okay, so if the physical mechanics of this impact are acting like a global aerosol spray, it begs the question, what exactly is in that cloud?
Well, look at the name.
Right. The text names the star Wormwood. The commentary explains this translates from the Greek word apsinthos, which is a bitterly tasting plant. It shows up like 8 times in the Old Testament, constantly used by Jewish writers as a metaphor for bitterness, poison, and death. So they explicitly named this falling star after a bitter poison.
And this is where the ancient metaphor of bitterness flawlessly syncs up with modern astrophysical data regarding comet chemistry.
The Royal Society of Chemistry paper.
Exactly. The paper authored by Matthews and Menard. They detail the exact chemical inventory of cometary nuclei, and they are packed with frozen volatiles. You've got methane, ammonia, water ice, and crucially enormous quantities of hydrogen cyanide.
Hydrogen cyanide, HCN. Not exactly something you want dissolving into your local river system.
Not at all.
Because cyanide is famous for being a colorless, intensely bitter poison. It has that distinct smell and taste of bitter almonds.
Right, the bitterness.
The commentary highlights this insane parallel. You have a 2,000-year-old text describing a fiery object poisoning water with a deadly bitter substance. And that brings us to the socio-political and ecological fallout described in the text.
Right. The narrative doesn't just say the comet hits the water. It explicitly names the star Wormwood and says that a third of the waters become wormwood, causing mass death among humans.
And it specifically points out the decimation of wildlife.
Which is terrifying when you think about the ripple effects.
Yeah.
If a third of the world's fresh water suddenly turns into toxic poison, you aren't just looking at immediate thirst. You're looking at instant catastrophic food chain disruption.
Complete ecological collapse.
Yes. The wildlife dies off. The livestock dies. The agriculture fails because the irrigation is poisoned. And if you look at it from the perspective of the socio-political structure, like the Antichrist's empire that the book of Revelation talks about,
that entire empire's infrastructure would buckle.
it would shatter. You can't maintain political dominance or economic stability when a third of the global population's food and water supply is just gone. The followers of that empire would be plunged into immediate famine and disease.
The societal control would just evaporate under that kind of ecological weight. It's absolute devastation. And the text roots all of this devastation in that one specific name, wormwood, or apsinthos in Greek.
Right, apsinthos. And we have to talk about what that word meant to the people writing and reading this text. In the Old Testament, wormwood is a botanical reality. It's a bitter shrub. But metaphorically, it's heavily associated with bitterness, poison, and death.
It represents God's anger.
Exactly, forcing humanity to drink the bitter cup of their own wickedness. So the ancient text is defining the payload of this fragmented star as a literal bitter poison. Here's where it gets really interesting. What does modern chemistry tell us about the actual contents of comets? Because if a 2,000-year-old text calls a fragmented comet a bitter poison, I want to know if astrobiology backs that up.
Well, the alignment is almost chilling, honestly. If you look at the research published in Faraday discussions, they analyze the complex organic chemistry happening on the surface of cometary nuclei.
Okay, so what do they find?
Well, comets are heavily loaded with frozen volatiles. We're talking methane, ammonia, water, carbon monoxide. They aren't just solid rock.
They are essentially deep freeze chemical laboratories.
That's a perfect way to describe them. And when those simple frozen molecules are subjected to the high-energy environment of deep space.
Like ultraviolet radiation, cosmic rays.
Exactly. When they get hit by that energy, they react and polymerize. They form dense, complex macromolecular structures known as hydrogen cyanide polymers.
Wait, hydrogen cyanide? I mean, cyanide is universally recognized as highly lethal.
Oh, incredibly lethal. It shuts down the body's ability to use oxygen at a cellular level. It's deeply toxic to aerobic organisms.
But beyond just being a poison, cyanide has a very specific sensory profile, right?
Yes. In chemistry, cyanide is scientifically known as a colorless, intensely bitter poison.
Think about that for a second. Just wow. The ancient text names the comet Wormwood, literally defining it as a bitter poison. And modern science confirms that comets are literally giant couriers of a bitter poison, hydrogen cyanide.
It's a flawless chemical parallel.
It really is.
And we actually have visual confirmation of this. These HCN polymers don't just exist deep inside the core of the comet. They accumulate on the surface, creating a distinct, dark crust. So how does a frozen block of space ice actually release this poison into the Earth's rivers and springs? Wouldn't the cyanide polymers just burn up entirely before they ever reach the ground?
That's a great point. To understand that transfer, we have to look at an experimental study by Frey and colleagues from 2004.
Okay, the one on polymer degradation.
Yes. They focused on the thermal degradation of polymers. Because on a comet, hydrogen cyanide doesn't just sit there as a free, loose gas.
Right.
Over billions of years in deep space, those molecules link together. They polymerize. And they form these highly complex, dark, tar-like crusts on the comet's surface.
Oh, like the dark spots we see on comets.
Exactly. We've actually photographed this dark material on comets like Halley and Wild 2.
Okay, so the researchers wanted to see what happens to this toxic tar when it's subjected to the extreme heat of burning up in the atmosphere.
Right. And their experimental setup demonstrated that when these stable HCN polymers hit temperatures over 300 degrees Celsius,
which an atmospheric airburst easily exceeds.
Oh, easily. The polymer chains shatter. They undergo rapid thermal degradation, breaking down from a solid crust into massive volumes of highly reactive toxic gases, specifically gaseous hydrogen cyanide and ammonia.
So tying this back to our atmospheric cluster bomb, as wormwood is burning like a torch and detonating in the stratosphere, the heat is actively refining that tar crust into a massive chemical weapon.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
It's literally pumping millions of tons of bitter, toxic cyanide gas into the upper atmosphere. And because cyanide and ammonia are highly soluble in water,
as soon as they hit atmospheric moisture, they dissolve into the rain.
the precipitation cycle effectively washes the atmosphere clean by dumping all that dissolved cyanide directly into the freshwater rivers and springs below. That matches the mechanics of the Third Trumpet perfectly.
The efficiency of that delivery system is just staggering. The comet uses the Earth's own weather cycle to distribute a lethal dose of hydrogen cyanide across the biosphere.
It's chilling. So let's visualize what that suffocation actually looks like on the ground. Because the ecological and societal disruption is catastrophic.
It really is.
It is an instant, total eradication of the aquatic ecosystem.
And that imagery aligns perfectly with the biological mechanism of cyanide poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
The biblical text states the waters were made bitter and that many men died from the waters.
Right.
But when massive quantities of hydrogen cyanide dissolve into a third of the fresh water supply, the devastation goes far beyond humanity just losing its drinking water. Cyanide operates by interfering with cellular respiration.
Okay, how does it do that?
Specifically, it binds to an enzyme in the mitochondria called cytochrome C oxidase.
So it physically blocks the cells from processing oxygen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The blood might be carrying plenty of oxygen, but the cells can't utilize it. For aquatic life, which already relies on the really delicate process of extracting dissolved oxygen from water through their gills.
Oh, a sudden influx of cyanide is instantaneously lethal.
Yes. The fish are literally suffocating at a cellular level in a river that is full of oxygen. That biological reality is why the fish in that visual source are depicted with those gaping mouths. They died gasping for breath on a microscopic level.
So what does this all mean for the survivors? Because if a third of global freshwater is rendered highly toxic and the aquatic life is instantly wiped out, we aren't just talking about a temporary health advisory where you have to boil your tap water.
No, not at all.
We are looking at total socio-ecological starvation, right? Let's look at this through the lens of the Antichrist's followers and empire, which is the context of these judgments.
Right.
Freshwater is the foundational resource for any empire or society to function.
It is the absolute bedrock of the food chain and the economy. When you poison the rivers, the immediate casualty is the wildlife that drinks from those banks. Then the agricultural systems fail.
Right, because the irrigation networks...
Exactly. The vast irrigation networks that pull from rivers like the Mississippi, the Yangtze, or the Rhine would be pumping poison directly into the soil.
Wow.
The crops wither, the herbivores starve, followed in very short order by the carnivores.
And humanity gets hit from every possible angle. You lose the aquatic food source, so the fishing industry vanishes overnight. You lose your agriculture. And the global supply chains and economies that rely on those river basins for transport and hydroelectric power grind to an immediate halt.
The societal infrastructure of that empire would fracture within days.
It has to.
Thirst and famine would drive mass, panicked migrations away from the poison zones, pushing millions of desperate refugees into the remaining territories.
Which means the geopolitical pressure on the remaining two-thirds of clean water would inevitably trigger devastating resource wars.
Exactly. For whatever global empire or leadership structure is in place, like the Antichrist empire described in the texts, the poisoning of the freshwater is a fatal blow. The initial cyanide exposure might kill a fraction of the population, but the ensuing starvation, economic collapse, and ecological decimation would permanently cripple the civilization.
It is an unrecoverable chain reaction.
Completely unrecoverable.
The scale of the devastation from a single celestial event is just staggering. Is it possible John, who wrote the Book of Revelation, just got incredibly lucky guessing the chemical payload of a comet?
That is the big question.
Right. Or is this just an uncanny alignment between an ancient vision and modern chemistry? Because he didn't just say the water was toxic, he specifically called it bitter.
It was very precise.
Thousands of years before the Royal Society of Chemistry published a paper on the high-energy chemical reactions of frozen methane and ammonia, this text says a fiery celestial torch is going to break up in the atmosphere, poison the fresh water, and kill people because it's better.
What's fascinating here is the absolute precision of the overlap. You have an ancient author observing or, envisioning an event and recording the exact sensory and physical details.
The flaming tail, the breakup.
Right. A flaming tail, atmospheric disintegration, widespread aquatic contamination, and a bitter lethality. Then you have modern chemists looking at the exact same type of celestial object, confirming that the high-energy entry of a comet would produce a massive amount of hydrogen cyanide.
Which is scientifically a bitter poison.
Exactly. The mechanics sync up flawlessly.
It completely reframes how you read the text. It's not just poetic doom and gloom anymore, It reads like a literal environmental impact report from an astrophysical event.
It really does.
Which brings us to the actual name given to this comet in the text. Wormwood.
Yes. The text explicitly says, quote, "The name of the star is called Wormwood."
So if the chemistry checks out, we have to talk about that name. Because they didn't call it the cyanide comet, obviously. They called it Wormwood.
They used the language of their era.
Right. So we need to bridge this literal chemistry we just talked about with the deep cultural metaphors of the time. Why that specific name?
To understand that, we have to look at the original Greek word used in the text, which is apsinthos.
Apsinthos, which is where we get the word absinthe, right? That incredibly bitter green liquor.
Exactly, yeah. Apsinthos, or wormwood, is an actual, literal bitter shrub. It's a plant known for its intense, really unpleasant taste, and it has a very deep, entrenched history in the cultural and religious texts of the region.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It is mentioned 8 different times in the Old Testament.
Our sources actually point out it shows up in books like Deuteronomy, Proverbs, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Amos.
Right. And in every single one of those contexts, the ancient Jews closely associated this plant with bitterness, poison, and death.
So it wasn't just like a plant you avoided because it tasted bad in your salad.
No. It was a cultural signal for calamity.
The sources mention that the Jews actually classified their sorrows, cruelties, and calamities by plants of a poisonous or bitter nature. which, if you think about it, is a really profound way to categorize your suffering.
It's a very visceral, physical way to understand pain.
Totally. You don't just say, oh, I'm experiencing a tragedy. You map your emotional and spiritual pain onto the most toxic, bitter thing in your physical environment. You say, I am experiencing wormwood.
It is a deeply grounded, agricultural way of understanding the world. You experience a profound sorrow or a terrible cruelty, and you immediately associate it with the natural world around you.
Because that's what you know.
Exactly. So when the text says a third of the waters became wormwood, it's operating on multiple levels at once.
So what does this all mean? We have a literal ecological disaster, a comet breaking up, hydrogen cyanide poisoning the global water supply, the food chain collapsing, fish dying, people dying.
The physical reality of it, yeah.
Yeah. But we also have this metaphorical poisoning of a society's morals. Are these ancient texts intentionally blurring these lines? Like, are they using a literal physical event to manifest a spiritual reality?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to understand the ancient mind. For them, the physical and the spiritual were not separated into two different boxes like they are for us today.
We like to compartmentalize everything.
We do. But they didn't view the universe as just cold, dead matter reacting to physics. The physical and the spiritual were deeply, inextricably intertwined.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
A literal, bitter poison falling from the sky perfectly symbolizes the bitter consequences of human actions.
It's like the universe itself is mirroring the internal state of humanity. The environment is physically reacting to a moral failing.
Exactly. Our sources highlight that the name wormwood represents God's anger. It draws directly on earlier passages like Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 13 through 15.
What happens in that passage?
The core concept there is about making men drink the bitter cup of their own wickedness.
Ah, the bitter cup.
Yes, the physical event, the comet, the kinetic energy, the cyanide, the poisoned water, all of that is just the mechanism. But the meaning of the event is the bitter cup.
The genius of the text is that it doesn't choose between the literal and the metaphorical. It demands both.
It absolutely does.
The star's bitter, poisonous nature is literally why it's called wormwood. It leaves a fiery trail, it breaks apart, it acts like a crop duster scattering lethal debris, it destroys the aquatic food chain, and it kills.
The mechanics are all there.
But the name itself tells you why it's happening, in a theological sense.
And the physical reality of the event actually grounds the theological message.
How so?
Well, if the physical description was just nonsense, if it didn't align at all with how celestial bodies actually behave in our atmosphere, it might be easier for a modern reader to dismiss the whole thing as purely symbolic, just a scary dream.
Right, you'd just say, oh, well, space rocks don't do that, so it's just a fairy tale.
Exactly. But the fact that the physics and the chemistry align so tightly with the ancient description gives an immense, undeniable weight to the narrative.
It really is wild to think about. You have this ancient writer trying to communicate the ultimate ecological calamity. He uses the imagery of wormwood, this bitter shrub associated with death and judgment.
Right.
And he maps it perfectly, just flawlessly, onto the exact sequence of events and chemical reactions that a modern astrophysicist would describe if a volatile comet hit the Earth's atmosphere.
It forces us to ask entirely new questions about human observation. I mean, how is this knowledge transmitted? How did an ancient writer describe the chemical payload of a celestial body with such pinpoint accuracy?
It really does blow your mind when you sit with it. So for you listening right now, let's bring all of this together. We started with what seemed like a purely mythical image from an ancient text.
An angel blowing a trumpet and a massive burning torch falling from the sky to poison the water.
A classic, terrifying, apocalyptic vision.
Right, something out of a movie.
Exactly. But by taking a multidisciplinary approach, by looking at it through the lens of history, linguistics, and modern science, we uncovered something incredible.
We discovered that the ancient description of this burning, disintegrating star perfectly mirrors the atmospheric entry and kinetic breakup of a comet.
It's the crop duster effect. And we saw it how the ancient description of the waters becoming fatally bitter aligns astonishingly well with the Royal Society of Chemistry's understanding of how frozen volatiles, like methane and ammonia, break down under extreme heat.
Right, to form hydrogen cyanide, which is a literal bitter poison.
And we explored how the cultural use of the word wormwood ties that literal chemical bitterness to a profound metaphor about human actions, sorrow, and divine judgment.
It really highlights the immense value of not just dismissing ancient texts as primitive poetry, right, but actually engaging with them seriously, looking at the how and the why behind the words.
Yeah, it reminds us that ancient people were observing the exact same universe we are. They just used a different vocabulary to describe its mechanics.
Beautifully said.
Which leaves us with one final thought for you to mull over today. We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of ancient literature being just beautiful, terrifying dreams, completely divorced from anything empirical.
Because we like to keep things neat.
We put ancient prophets and modern scientists in completely different boxes.
We do, yeah.
But if an ancient apocalyptic text can accurately describe the physical mechanics of atmospheric entry and the specific chemical payload of a comet using the metaphors of their time, I mean, literally thousands of years before the Royal Society of Chemistry published their findings.
It makes you wonder.
It really does. What other ancient myths or prophetic visions might just be advanced science waiting for the right translation?
9.